E ngā mana i ngā reo i ngā rau rangatira mā tēnā rā koutou katoa. Ko te mea tuatahi he mihi atu ki ngā tini aitua o te rānei, me he mihi ki ngā mana whenua o tēnei rohe, me mihi atu ki te whare tū nei ngā mihi ana. Kia o koutou tini mate, haere atu rā. Āpiti hono tātai hono te hunga mate ki te hunga mate, āpiti hono tātai hono te hunga ora ki te hunga ora. Kia ora mai koutou katoa. Just getting my bearings on stage, the lights are blaring, and for the first time in a long time, I'm actually quite nervous to deliver a talk. Because as Furman sort of stated, this is a much more personal, slightly autobiographical kind of look at why I do what I do, and an interesting time in my life after just having a baby and being quite conscious of the fact that, why am I doing architecture? It has been a big part of my maternity leave internal dialogue. So it's an interesting time to be here and presenting this talk to you. I wanted to say that just for the sake of not being sued by the NZIA, I'm also not a registered architect. I did ask Furman when he initially approached me if that was somehow an issue, but I also say that because the process to get to being a registered architect is one that I really respect. And that people put a hell of a lot of effort into that, and I have not yet undertaken that in my life. But I do a lot of other things. I make, I create, I breathe life into spaces, and I breathe life into stories. And so I'm happy to be here in the architectural space, but I will not call myself an architect. And I guess given that this particular story is going to be cemented in history on the internet for all time, I kind of needed to say that so that I didn't get sued. So kia ora. Obviously, when I started out, I had to kind of ask myself, well, where do I begin on this story? How do I unpack kind of what has influenced me to become the person that I am, to do the work that I do? To create the architecture, to create the spaces, to tell the stories that shape our built environment. Was it a simple question of whakapapa, of genealogy, of who I am and where I've come from? Do I go all the way back to Ranginui and Papa Tuanuku? Is that the influence? Do I think about these milestones in Aotearoa's history and their significant relationship to forming both the monumental opportunities that Māori saw, as well as the catastrophic failures of the colonial project? Effectively, as I sort of circled around these thoughts in my head late at night often, in between breastfeeding my daughter, I really decided that the things that I wanted to focus on were kind of these ideas that have resonated in my life over my life, things that people have told me, things that have stuck, good and bad, and, their relationship to people, their relationship to moments in time. As a result, there's no semblance of chronology in tonight's talk. I'm sort of interspersing vignettes, I suppose. These are things, these are moments in time. You can stitch together point A to point B however you want to in your mind, or awkwardly you could Google me, up to you. But I do need to start with whakapapa. I do need to tell the story kind of my relationship to my parents, of course, and sort of where I've come from to kind of place me in space and time. So for many that know, I te taho tōku pāpā on my father's side, he uri a hau no Ngāpuhi, Ngātiwai, me Waikato Tainui. So I'm a descendant of the tribes of Ngāpuhi, Ngātiwai, and Waikato Tainui. I grew up though here in Tāmaki Makaurau in Auckland. I'm trying to think of what direction I'm in right now, but out west. But I largely visited two places a lot as a child, camping and fishing. The first isn't pictured here, but I grew up going fishing, actually whitebaiting on the Waikato River with my auntie and uncle on a small kind of floating batch that we made, built, and then floated out behind the boat. And the second place I grew up visiting a lot as a child was here in my whānau land in Whangaruru. We camped a lot on the farmlands out in front of our marae. This marae, this building here, is actually since burnt down in 2013. But we grew up camping there for sort of 2 to 3 weeks at a time. And that really sort of formed a lot of my relationship around the outdoors, my relationship to my whānau up north, and really kind of stoked that fire and that relationship to coming from the north, even though I grew up here in Tāmaki Makaurau. My father grew up here. He was born in Hikurangi, and sort of migrated to the urban realities of Auckland, as many men did in the 70s. His schooling ended somewhat abruptly when he, at the age of 13 and around 6 foot tall, decided to punch the principal after being caned for something he didn't think was worth the punishment. So you can take whatever you want about my dad's temperament and or sort of the realities of who he was as a young man at that time, but it was very much kind of what it felt like, I suppose, for him. And that story he used to tell me was, kind of about the horrors of being a young brown man in school, not being allowed to speak te reo, and that eventually having a huge impact on his life later in life. My mother was born in Takapuna, here in Auckland, to a Samoan Tokelauan woman who was born in Apia, and an English father from Portsmouth, England. Both migrated to Aotearoa in the 50s, and my mum's family were this large Samoan Tokelauan kind of Catholic family. My nana's siblings, of course, all being sent here one after the other through the kind of 50s and 60s, with this real expectation to kind of follow that land of milk and honey, hopes and dreams that they had for the future generations of their family that they saw as being possible here in Aotearoa. That effectively meant that my mum grew up on a street in the North Shore as one of 24 first cousins. And it also meant that the sort of habitual Catholicism of my family resulted in Christmas and Easter lunches every year, my whole life, with roughly 120 of us as my first kind of immediate family members. What I forgot to mention as well is my dad was the middle child of 16. So on both sides of my family, I've always maintained that I was somewhat political by necessity, because I fundamentally come from a family of about 500 people. There's no simple, easy, or clear way of really bringing the story of my mother and father together. The reality of the relationship that then bore myself and my twin brothers is a story kind of littered with a bit of pain, a bit of trauma, and the realities of resilience, kind of tenacity and survival. I did really wonder about how much trauma dumping I would do in this particular talk tonight, so I'm trying to keep it to a minimum. But my father very easily falls into that category of Māori men who were quite adrift, landless, languageless, and really undereducated, looking for work, and unfortunately kind of the realities of addictions and other issues that followed them into the cities. My mum was, for the most part, encouraged by her English father to just get married, and that would sort everything out somehow. So she wasn't allowed to drive, and she was not allowed to get an education. So as you can imagine, that sort of frames a childhood in a particular way where we lived in somewhat poverty for the majority of kind of my childhood. In the 90s, my great-grandmother, my English great-grandmother, gave my mum $5,000 for the deposit on this house, which was a 40 square metre railway home cottage in Ranui, out west, for a small family of 5. So this house could not fit anything more than one armchair that my dad would sit on. The TV that you obviously were the physical human remote, you had to go up and, turn it, to push the buttons. One dining room table with 2 chairs, and a bathroom that didn't have a sink. We were a family of 5 living in a really tiny house, and often with a lot of our family of 500 coming to visit and stay with us. It's also in this house that I learnt to draw the bird's eye view of my dream home from a teacher who taught me what a bird's eye view was, and I would sit in the top bunk above my 2 twin brothers, dreaming about what it would mean to bring my brothers and I out of poverty. Performing. I think I've pretty much spent my entire life around performers and performance. I once asked my dad, how do you get on stage and not be so nervous? My dad was this guy that would get up there larger than life and crack jokes. And he said, I tell jokes to cut through the nerves. The only way I can function without shaking to death. Apparently I take after my dad. I'm not sure. So this is a little bit of a story about my dad and his influence on my life. He was a musician. He taught himself to play bass guitar by ear. Didn't know a chord. Couldn't tell you what chords you were playing. You just knew where your fingers went on the guitar. He won every karaoke competition he ever entered, often with Mustang Sally, for better or worse. He went to every single tangi up and down the countryside. I feel like he was at a tangi almost every single week. And his job, and therefore my job as I got older, was to sing in the marae all day and all night to keep the body warm until it was buried. The other performers in my life were, pretty omnipresent as well. My nan and my granddad actually met because they were champion rock and roll dancers. My nan was also the family seva queen. She was up the front every time we had a family event leading the dancers. Both my dad and my stepdad later in life were also involved in the film industry. So this sort of creative outlet, creative passion became a big influence in my life as well. So it's sort of one of the fun oddities of my childhood was that I grew up on film and TV sets all over the countryside. My mum and dad ran the security teams, and they ran the men that had the trucks that kind of went up around the country. And my stepdad was a sound engineer. So I don't have good photos of us running around the sets of Xena and Hercules, like half of Auckland was at the time. But I used to knock on the rocks and knock on the walls, and they'd all echo back because they were made of polystyrene. And I thought that was really fantastic. One of my first kind of jobs was literally putting the costumes into the washing machine for the costume designers. So that was sort of my childhood. And then later in life, with the introduction of my stepdad, I actually found myself during university working as a sound engineer, doing Foley and atmospheres for a number of films, working with Chelsea Winstanley, working with Merata Meta, working with Vincent Ward and others. And actually, that was a moment where I kind of realized that sound engineering was a lot like making architecture, because you were fundamentally creating the sonic experience of space. Sorry, Linda. These 2 quotes are connected. In a job interview I once had with a boomer who shall not be named, he said, "You seem a bit ambitious." And up until that point, I'd never actually had my interests and my life reframed with such an undertone of disdain. Later in life, I met a woman named Linda Simmons, whose mentorship, friendship, and allyship has always been really critical to my journey. And she said to me, "Never apologize for being a strong woman." Guess which one stuck? And I've grown up around strong women. Strength has survival and resilience, though I would be very, very happy if not one more woman had to use resilience as a badge of honor. The story I do want to tell, though, is about my great-grandmother. Irene Maud Knight. No children will be getting her middle name, sorry, Nan. But born in England in 1918, her first husband died in World War II, and quickly becoming a solo mother in World War II in the UK, she went to work. She worked on the cranes in the naval shipyard in Portsmouth during the kind of, as the bomb sirens would go off. She would tell me about how she'd have to make the decision there and then as to whether or not she would sit through the bomb threat or climb down sort of 3 to 4 stories down these cranes, because all the power would go off. She was a pretty fearless woman in my mind to be a female working at that time under kind of critical danger. She unfortunately met her second husband, who we will just simply describe as unworthy, because he relocated her to New Zealand against her will in the early 50s. He did that because she made a lot of money, actually, as a crane operator in Portsmouth, because it was effectively a death job. It was kind of seen as a bit of a suicide role. And so he thought that was pretty lucrative and shifted her over here. But actually, she had a really phenomenal story by the time she moved to New Zealand, because what she also did was built their units by hand herself. So she had this just great ability to sort of take some of the sometimes horrific situations she was in and make the best of it. And I always really admired her for that. As I spoke to before, the introduction of Linda and Architecture Women by way of Sarah Treadwell to my life in 2012 also has really changed the course of the way I viewed practice, architecture, and my relationship to it. Linda helped me understand how much of the institutional systems I was working within, architecture, education, practice, had been framed to suit a very patriarchal view, and even more so one that was quite oppressive of myself as a Māori and Pacific Island woman. So probably around 100,000 coffees and hours of discussions, teaching together and friendship. She has been one of the key influences in my life when it's really come to thinking about what my voice can do in this space for myself and for others. In my 20s, a friend said to me, "You are the sum total of your 5 closest relationships." I sort of realized that fundamentally we are a reflection of where we put our energy. And because of that, I made a lot of really deliberate moves in my life to start to foster a particular kind of community that I also felt reflected me. Because I had grown up in particular levels of poverty and deprivation, that also meant that that was sometimes what I was surrounded by. And I wanted to find success and excellence, people striving to do different things. And I knew that that was around, but I also knew I had to cultivate it. But there's an interesting thing about community and responsibility, and a recent experience of that showed up in my inbox. So, as was spoken about in that lovely, slightly awkward 2-minute video there, because oh my gosh, hearing my bio was always challenging. Jasmax worked on, I'm a principal at Jasmax, and I am the first Samoan woman to hold a leadership role at that firm. But 50 odd years ago, Jasmax, then JasMad, designed the building Maota Samoa, or Samoa House. And at the time, that was the first whale outside of Samoa to be built in New Zealand. So the responsibility that showed up in my inbox as I was talking about was that the Friends of Samoa House Trust contacted me about their beloved building, because fundamentally the building is in a bit of a state of disrepair and needs a lot of love. But they looked at me as the first woman of Samoan descent in a leadership position at the firm that designed this building many years before I was born, and they still said, "You actually have a responsibility to show up for this, because your kind of cultural relationship to it means that you're in it whether you want to be or not." And that was kind of a lesson for me in the realities of the kind of cultural labour and cultural connection that we have to our projects as Māori and Pasifika people, well beyond the usual, I've done a job, I've detailed a job, I've seen it on site, maybe I stay at this firm, maybe I don't. This project will follow me because it is the Samoan community and I am Samoan. In 2021, under the photographs of 50 years of protest, occupation and assembly captured by John Miller, I received my moko kauai, the chin markings of my people, surrounded by well over 100 friends and family inside the exhibition I designed. This was a moment of taking on customary markings as the first woman in my family for over 100 years. Any palatability or racial bias that my fair skin might have originally afforded me disappeared that day. And 1,000 years of ancestral connection came alive in the responsibility I have to my people, my family, my language, and my land. And I take all of that on by wearing those marks. My mum used to tell me as a kid, no point in being brainy if you've got no street smarts. That's always resonated through my life. As far as she was concerned, and many other people in my life, it's your attitude that gets you somewhere. The intellect, the skills, those parts will come later. And I actually always thought that I was not super smart, just sort of like hardworking. But that was largely because street smarts was the thing that was valued in our house. We didn't really know how to do the academic smart. That wasn't what either of my parents grew up with. But it sort of meant that I had to grab hold of that intergenerational tenacity that the women in my family seemed to have harbored, which was an amazing strength, and brace myself for the realities of working within an industry as an absolute minority, trying to represent architecture that was still also an absolute minority. It's been a slow journey of trying to find those whose attitude I felt translated into the ethic, the style, the curiosity, the innovation that I resonated with. What do I care about as a designer? What am I trying to do? Particularly through the worldview that grounds me culturally. University introduced me to Dewi Thompson. I don't really need to talk much about him because this whole room will know who he is, and everybody online for future reference, Google him. Many know and love him, and for me, it was really his attitude, his wonder that came to thinking about traditions, thinking about our customs, being speculative and imagining these amazing outcomes that I was really attracted to. That attitude was something that reverberated through me. Other projects like Te Miringate Kākara, the four-sided wharenui, other thinkers like Rua Kienana, they've opened doors to universes in my mind that have made me sort of turn over that rock of tradition to think about what other possibilities might open up when I'm grounded in my sense of self and I have the possibility to think laterally. Something that's important to me other than memes, obviously, I'm still a millennial, has just been thinking about the opportunity to rebuild myself, and I've had to do this multiple times. The GFC was one of them. Spent 4 years out of uni without a job, and I worked in about 50 different jobs, sometimes at 100 hours a week, just to survive. But I suppose one of the things I wanted to think about in relation to rock bottom was also the loss of loved ones and what that does to you. And for me, I guess the thing that I wanted to reflect on in that was that I actually think if I was to die tomorrow, I wouldn't be particularly fussed if anybody said she was an architect or showed a reel of buildings that I had worked on. I'd really want people to talk about the way I made them feel. I'd really want them to think about the fact that what I feel is my purpose, which is to attempt to make transformational change for my people, is the thing that I am trying to do and show up for every single day, whether that is architecture or not. Which really speaks to legacy. That's my big thing at the moment. I'm thinking about it a lot because I made a tiny human being. Her name is Rukuai. She is my whole entire universe. The creation of her, learning to parent, attempting to raise her in our community with the strength, potentiality, sass, wonder, all the amazing things is amazing and tough because I'm trying not to leak my intergenerational traumas all over my child. And I want her to know all the things she can be without all of the limitations I've had on me. Becoming a mother has made me dig in my heels. It's made me grittier. It's made me angrier. It's made me happier, more passionate, and fundamentally more driven to deliver better outcomes for my people. That's what I think makes me the designer I am. Kia ora.
It was beautiful to be able to know so many aspects of you that we didn't know. And you mentioned being a mother makes you angrier.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Because I feel like the injustices of the world, and there are plenty this day and age, kind of hit you deeper. the realities of our responsibility to climate change and the environment, and how catastrophic that all is and what we're leaving for our children feels omnipresent in my day-to-day life. So it's kind of funny. It's probably also hormones, but I'm definitely angrier. And I've decided to just embrace it, because I think women have been told for far too long just to let the anger go.
Yeah.
So rage mum hashtag is kind of what I'm going for. But look, I like to channel that stuff because I think that it makes you think harder and be smart about the decisions you're making, because you have to be, right? So I'm all about being slightly angrier.
Well, embrace it.
Yeah, I am.
There, you have also mentioned your grandmother, and I read about a story that she kind of had lottery
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
magazines with kind of you could win a mansion in the Golden Coast or something like
Yeah.
that. So you were like, you thought that that will be that big houses.
Yeah.
You kind of connected that to wealth, happiness, and being healthy. I wonder, what do you? I guess your vision of wealth, happiness, and and being healthy has changed. What do you associate to that nowadays?
It looks very different nowadays. But obviously, when you're a little person in a house where, you know, your entire day's conversation is circulating around whether or not you've got lunch. You know, so the theoretical conversation happening in our government at the moment about whether or not kids have lunch. I was one of those kids that would often go to school without lunch. So, you know, the reality is that when you're in that kind of a world, anything looks rich, looks wealthy, looks amazing. So yeah, my nan used to buy us these crazy lotteries, and it'd have these big, really ugly houses now. Like, good God, I wouldn't want to live in
Well, that
them.
you were a kid, right?
Yeah,
You
but
thought
as
were
a
amazing.
kid, they had a pool. Everybody had their own room. We weren't living on top of each other. And because our number one fight in our house was about the lack, I saw that as an opportunity to have everything that my parents were fighting about. So yeah, absolutely. I associated really strange amounts of wealth, I guess, in the Gold Coast of all places, to being healthy and to having kind of a settled life as a small person. Nowadays, for me, that looks like actually it looks like what I've got. It looks like a healthy relationship. It looks like food on the table. It looks like conversations and reading books. And those are really different conversations that I have with my daughter that my parents weren't quite able to.
I guess also good community. I
Yeah,
guess
100%. They were quite isolated, the two of them. There were points in my life where a lot of people didn't know the situation we were in. So, sorry, I said I wasn't going to trauma dump, and then this has become a therapy session with 150 people. That's fine. Welcome to my life.
embrace
Woo.
No.
Look, but I also think that those experiences are what make me a better advocate for the kinds of places I'm
Yes.
designing.
So what you put in it, you would say that what you put energy in that kind of defines you at the same
Yeah,
time.
absolutely. It's why I made a conscious decision to not necessarily want to design houses for single people. I've got no issues with mum and dad, beautiful homes. You know, I look at the magazines just like everybody else, and I'm going, oh my God, this is gorgeous. But it was a deliberate decision I made because it didn't fulfill my purpose to support my community in the way I needed to.
And one of the first things that you mentioned in your talk is that you it's important to kind of understand yourself, where you're coming from,
Yep.
and you define that as a key also to being a good architect or doing good architecture.
Yep.
My question would be, how do you think traditional architect in a country like Spain, I'm from Spain, so a person from another reality, if they if they kind of get deep into their story and where they are from, how will that change the way they practice?
I suppose I'm framing it from the perspective of it gives me a purpose around how I design and why I design in a certain way. And so I suppose it depends largely on what magical person from Spain is driven to do, and what their why is. And that for me is the important part. I guess something that I've noticed as my understanding of te ao Māori, of architecture in the Pacific, has kind of deepened and widened as I've gotten older, not necessarily wiser, is that it's given me a particular view that a lot of my studies was actually framed from this Western point of view, where you're kind of creating these beautiful objects in space. That's how it felt. It felt like architecture was this really wonderful sculptural exploration, and it can be. But from my perspective, I needed architecture to exist in the social fabric more. And so that's where deepening my understanding of place and tradition and all of those things gives my architecture more of a footing, to use a really terrible pun. Sorry. Anyway, yeah. I don't know if that explains that well.
I understand what you mean about the purpose. At the same time, it should connect like from your background and your heritage, and you will find a meaning in a way.
It's the meaning I choose to ascribe. It's not necessarily what everybody needs.
And there was something you say that you didn't mention it in your talk, but about how architects practice, about sustainability, about the crisis that we are living. You mentioned that our thinking, so Maori and Indigenous people, design principles, is a way forward to the traditional way of thinking. Would you like to explain briefly what do you mean by that?
It's very hard to explain briefly, but the way I suppose I would position it, to think about a term that we use here, and I'm sorry, you've been here for 2 days, so we use te reo Māori a lot, but the term kaitiakitanga, tiakitanga, to be kaitiaki is all around the sort of interconnected relationship that we have with the environment. The thing with Indigenous peoples, or to some, what makes you Indigenous is the fact that you have a lived relationship, or relational kind of interconnection with the environment beyond just other people. So there are mountains that I consider to be my ancestors. It's why we have a lot of rivers and mountains and things in New Zealand at the moment gaining personhood. So what that means to me is that the Indigenous view, or the Indigenous lived experience, is helping architecture to reframe the way we care about the environment, because they're now kin. They're not materials to use. They're not resources to exploit, to throw away. You might then think about what you're discarding or using, and how and why differently. You might think about a building living and dying as opposed to being built and then demolished. So I don't know if I've packaged that answer very well, but for me it's just that it's every Indigenous peoples that I meet as I travel, everyone has this interlocked relationship with their environment that treats things as if they are family. And what that does to your worldview as you are designing things, it changes fundamentally your relationship to the architecture you build as well. Because then the buildings have personhood, or they have particular stories as well. So, I basically just think that Indigenous people will save the world is kind of the crux of that argument.
There are definitely many things to learn. Right, and I see that what you mean, will give you a sense of responsibility.
Yes.
To what we do, and be more cautious and be careful, and that are attributes that will be helpful for such a situation.
Yes.
Elisapeta, thank you for the beautiful talk. We really appreciate it. It was an honor to have you on the stage. Thank you.